On the night of June 24th, 1973, the deadliest fire in New Orleans history was set at a working-class gay bar called the Upstairs Lounge. The fire claimed 32 lives in 19 minutes and was the largest massacre of queer people in U.S. history until the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016. Welcome back to Yesterqueers. My name's Amanda, and I'm a public historian of queer history. We're talking about a tough chapter in our history today, so proceed accordingly. I am going to talk about the actual fire, but we're not going to linger there, because what happened after the fire is equally as important and relevant to the world that we're living in today. The Upstairs Lounge was a neighborhood bar on the second floor of a 19th century building at the edge of the French Quarter. The entrance was up a narrow set of wooden stairs, and the door at the top of the stairs was kept closed to prevent police officers and other undesirables from getting curious and wandering upstairs. The front room had a bar and a lounge, and the back room was a small theater where they held talent shows and fundraisers for the local children's hospital, and for a while they hosted the Metropolitan Community Church's Sunday morning services. It was a refuge for queer people, mostly men, many of whom were not out at work or in the rest of their lives. It was a place where they could just be. And the Upstairs Lounge was always packed on Sunday nights because they had a beer bust from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. when customers could chase away the Sunday scaries with $1 all-you-could-drink beers. At the end of every beer bust, the bar's pianist led a sing-along of the 1970 Brotherhood of Man song, United We Stand. According to eyewitness accounts, on this particular Sunday, a 26-year-old gay man named Roger Dale Nunez was making a pest of himself during the beer bust, sexually harassing other patrons and trying to pick fights. So the bartender, Buddy Rasmussen, threw him out. Customers overheard Nunez yelling that he was going to burn them all out as he was leaving. By 7:56 p.m., the crowd had thinned to about 60 people. Over the sound of the jukebox and people singing around the piano, the front door buzzer started to ring. Assuming that it was a taxi cab picking up one of the customers, a man named Luther Boggs opened the door. When he did, he found the stairwell entirely engulfed in flame, and the fire roared through the bar. The windows were barred to prevent burglaries, so there were only 3 ways out of the Upstairs Lounge: down the stairwell that was already on fire, or out one of 2 emergency exits that were not marked. A handful of people took their chances and ran through the flames to the street. 12 people, including this man, Rusty Quinton, managed to squeeze through the 10-inch gaps between the window bars and jump to safety. And Rasmussen, who was a military vet with fire training, safely led 22 people through the emergency exit behind the stage. The fire station was only 3 blocks away, and even though they got held up by traffic, the fire was extinguished by 8:20. When first responders got into the building, they discovered that 28 people had not made it out. Another 4 people, including Luther Boggs, died at or on the way to the hospital. As Daniel Villarreal wrote for LGBTQ Nation in 2023, the indignities began almost immediately, and the real hate crime happened afterward with the inhuman response of the city, state, and church. Just minutes after the fire, Rasmussen grabbed Nunez out of the crowd and dragged him over to a police officer to be arrested, but the cop told them to keep it moving. And in fact, they never did arrest or even question Nunez. The fire marshal's investigation identified him as a person of interest, and Nunez confessed to 3 separate people, including his partner, while he was drunk. But the New Orleans Police Department closed the arson investigation after just a couple of months, and it remains officially unsolved to this day. The police also dragged their heels about identifying the victims, telling a local paper that it was hard because criminals often hung out at that bar and homosexuals often carry false identification. 4 men were buried in unmarked, unrecorded graves in a potter's field without ever being officially identified, in spite of the fact that one of them, a military veteran named Ferris LeBlanc, was identified by a friend. LeBlanc's family loved him and knew he was gay and would have claimed his body, but they didn't find out what happened to him until 2015. They are still fighting with the city of New Orleans to locate and exhume his body so that they can rebury him with his full military honors. The fire was front-page news coast to coast when it happened, but as soon as word got out that the Upstairs Lounge was a gay bar, coverage dried up. Well, except for the local paper, the Times-Picayune, which published the names of the deceased and the survivors, outing many of them. Closeted survivors and community members not only couldn't talk about the fire, except with each other, but they also had to endure cruel jokes about flaming queens getting what they deserved, and the real tragedy being that anyone managed to escape. 32 people were dead, and yet the mayor of New Orleans, the governor of Louisiana, and the Catholic archbishop said nothing for weeks. That's not exactly true. The archbishop did tell local Catholic churches not to perform burials or funerals for non-Catholic victims. In fact, many churches refused to perform funerals for the victims. And when the Reverend William P. Richardson held a prayer service at St. George's Episcopal Church the night after the fire, the Diocese of Louisiana rebuked him, and he received hate mail for weeks. A public memorial service was eventually held at St. Mark's Methodist Church, and the mourners, in an act of astonishing bravery, chose to exit the church through the front doors and face the gathered press rather than sneak out through a side door. And as if all that wasn't enough, an appeals court also blocked 19 different lawsuits suing state and city agencies for failing to inspect the upstairs lounge for fire hazards for more than 2 years. The week of the fire was the 4-year anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, but this was not New Orleans' Stonewall moment. Homosexuality was still classified as a mental disorder in June of 1973. The American Psychiatric Association wouldn't vote to remove it from the DSM until the end of that year. And somewhere around 65% of Americans surveyed believed that homosexuality was harmful to American life. The only frame of reference that most straight Americans had for sexual contact between men was a brutal rape scene from the 1972 film Deliverance, that historian Thomas Borselman says contributed to an enduring popular association of homosexuality with sexual deviance and violence. New Orleans had had a thriving LGBTQ+ community for at least a century at this point. Follow historian Quinn Bishop for the queer history of New Orleans. But it wasn't a hub of activism like New York City or San Francisco. The queer social scene was still mostly underground in New Orleans in 1973. And while this tragedy was galvanizing in a lot of ways, especially for people like Alfred Doolittle and Stuart Butler, it was also terrifying. National activists who arrived in the city shortly after the fire, hoping to whip the community into action, discovered a city that just wanted to lay low for a while. So they left. But if you know anything about New Orleans, you know that they didn't stay down for long. The upstairs lounge fire is one of the deadliest tragedies of the 20th century, and yet most people, even in New Orleans, have no idea that it happened. Historians and activists have been fighting for decades to make sure that we don't lose the story of the fire and its victims. Last year, a brand new plaque was placed at the site of the upstairs lounge, replacing one that was stolen in 2024. That's it for today. As always, more information, including sources and further reading, is available in the usual place.